Hello. If you're here to rest, to let your mind settle, or simply to listen to something steady as the day ends, welcome. This is Sleepless Veteran. We tell military history slowly, calmly, without drama or urgency. Just facts unfolding at a pace that lets you breathe, that lets you process, that lets you rest. Tonight we're going to a place that tested every limit of human endurance. The Eastern Front of World War II, from 1941 to 1945, nearly 4 years. A front line that stretched over 2,000 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, from the German border to the depths of the Soviet Union. This wasn't a battle, wasn't a campaign, was something larger, something that consumed nations, that killed on a scale humanity had never seen before and hasn't seen since. The numbers are so large they lose meaning. 27 million Soviet citizens dead, 4 million German soldiers dead, over 30 million total casualties. These aren't just statistics. Each number was a person, had a name, had a family, had a life that ended in the freezing mud or the burning ruins or the starvation camps, or the prisoner enclosures, or the urban rubble. But the scale is so vast that individual stories disappear into the mass. The challenge is holding both, the incomprehensible scale and the individual human cost. This is a story about distance, about soldiers marching over 1,000 kilometers on foot, about supply lines that stretched until they broke, about armies trying to fight across distances larger than countries. This is a story about cold, about temperatures 40 degrees below zero, about frostbite that took fingers and toes and ears, about men freezing to death while they slept, about winter that killed regardless of nationality or ideology. This is a story about cities. Leningrad besieged for 872 days. Stalingrad ground to rubble over 6 months of continuous combat. Berlin destroyed in the final battle. Cities that became graves, that became symbols, that became evidence of what total war means when it's fought without limits, without mercy, without any consideration beyond victory or death. This is a story about starvation, about prisoners deliberately starved in open camps, about civilians starving in besieged cities, about soldiers starving in encirclements, about hunger as weapon, as policy, as reality that killed millions. This is a story about attrition, about armies consumed faster than they could be replaced, about the mathematics of loss that predicted outcomes, that showed some battles couldn't be won regardless of courage or skill. We're not here to make judgments, not here to assign blame or celebrate victories, just here to understand. To see what happened when two totalitarian systems collided, when ideological war met geographic vastness, met climate extremes, met total commitment from both sides. The result was the most destructive conflict in human history. Was catastrophe, measured in dimensions beyond normal comprehension. So settle in, get comfortable. What follows is calm, is steady. We'll move through this history together, from the invasion of June 1941 to the surrender of May 1945, from the border to Moscow to Stalingrad to Berlin, from summer heat to winter cold to spring mud and back again, through 4 years that changed everything, that killed tens of millions, that left scars that remain visible 80 years later. Take your time. Breathe slowly. This history is heavy, but we'll carry it together. We'll walk through it steadily. We'll try to understand what happened, what it meant, what it cost. The Eastern Front, the most brutal battlefield in human history. Let's begin at the beginning, at the border. At dawn on June 22nd, 1941, when 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. When the catastrophe began, 27 million. The Soviet death toll from the Eastern Front, 27 million people. To understand this number, Consider that if you counted one name per second, it would take over 10 months of continuous counting to name them all. One person every second. For 10 months, without pause, without sleep. The number is so large it exceeds comprehension, becomes abstract, stops being about people and becomes just a statistic. But each number was a person. A soldier freezing in a foxhole outside Moscow. A woman starving in Leningrad. A child killed in the bombing of a city whose name most people don't remember. A prisoner dying in an open camp in Poland. A civilian shot in a massacre in Ukraine. Each of the 27 million had a story, had a life, had people who loved them, had futures that ended in the catastrophe of the Eastern Front. The Soviet dead break down into categories that are themselves staggering. Military deaths numbered between 8 and 11 million. The estimates vary. Record-keeping was imperfect. Many died unrecorded. But the general range is accepted. 8 to 11 million Soviet soldiers died. Some in combat, some from wounds, some from disease, some from starvation, some from exposure. The variety of causes shows that death came from every direction. From enemy action and friendly incompetence and environmental factors and simple exhaustion. Civilian deaths numbered between 15 and 17 million. More civilians than soldiers. The civilians died from many causes. Direct military action, bombing, shelling, massacres by German forces and local collaborators. The Holocaust extended across all occupied Soviet territory. Entire Jewish communities were exterminated. Other groups were targeted. Partisans, communists, anyone deemed undesirable. The systematic killing numbered in millions, but many civilians died from indirect causes. From starvation in occupied territory, from disease, from exposure, from the collapse of systems that kept society functioning. The destruction of infrastructure meant food couldn't be distributed. Medical care collapsed, shelter disappeared. The occupied population suffered and died even when they weren't specifically targeted. The war created conditions where survival became impossible for millions. The German death toll on the Eastern Front was approximately 4 million soldiers. 4 million out of approximately 18 million who served in the Wehrmacht during the war. The Eastern Front consumed German military strength, killed at rates that exceeded any other theater. The comparison is stark. The entire Western Allied military effort in Europe from D-Day to German surrender resulted in approximately 200,000 American deaths. The Pacific Theater saw approximately 100,000 American deaths. The Western Allies' total casualties were measured in hundreds of thousands. The Eastern Front's casualties were measured in tens of millions. The Eastern Front consumed approximately 80% of German military casualties during World War II. 80%. 4 out of every 5 German soldiers who died in the war died fighting the Soviet Union. The scale shows where the war was actually decided, shows where the real fighting occurred. The Western Front was important, the Pacific was important, but the Eastern Front was the war's center of gravity, was where the outcome was determined, was where the vast majority of killing occurred. The geographic scale matched the human scale. The front line at its maximum extent stretched over 2,000 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, over 1,200 miles. For comparison, that's roughly the distance from New York to Florida, from London to southern Italy. The armies fighting along this front had to coordinate operations across distances that exceeded anything in military history. The challenge of command and control was immense. The challenge of logistics was overwhelming. The depth of the front was equally vast. From the German border to Moscow was approximately 1,000 kilometers, 620 miles. From the border to Stalingrad was approximately 2,000 kilometers, 1,240 miles. These distances had to be traversed, had to be supplied across, had to be fought across. The soldiers mostly moved on foot. Day after day, week after week, month after month. The exhaustion accumulated. The distances killed through exhaustion before combat even began. The duration was nearly 4 years. From June 22nd, 1941 to May 8th, 1945. 1,420 days of war, of continuous operations, of fighting that paused sometimes but never stopped, of casualties that accumulated day after day, week after week, month after month, for nearly 4 years. The duration allowed the catastrophe to build, to compound, to reach dimensions that shorter conflicts couldn't achieve. The environmental extremes added to every other factor. Summer temperatures exceeded 35 degrees Celsius, 95 Fahrenheit. The heat was oppressive, water was scarce, dust choked, equipment overheated. Winter temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 Fahrenheit, often much colder. Minus 40 wasn't uncommon. At these temperatures, exposed skin froze in minutes. Frostbite was epidemic. The cold killed directly and weakened soldiers, so that disease and combat killed more easily. The Rasputitsa occurred twice yearly, in spring when snow melted, in autumn when rains came. The unpaved roads became mud, deep, glutinous, impassable. Vehicles sank, horses sank. Men marched through mud to their knees. Movement became measured in meters per hour instead of kilometers. Supply stopped, operations halted. Armies waited for the ground to freeze or dry. The Rasputitsa was unplanned ally to defenders, was obstacle that no amount of force could overcome, could only be endured, could only be waited out. The ideological nature of the war intensified everything. This wasn't war for territory or resources alone. Was ideological war, war of annihilation. Hitler viewed the Soviet Union as existential threat, viewed Slavic peoples as subhuman, viewed communism as evil that must be destroyed. The Nazi ideology made the Eastern Front different from the Western Front, made it more brutal, made it total in ways that war in France or Italy never approached. Stalin's Soviet Union was a totalitarian system that could absorb catastrophic losses and continue, could sacrifice millions and demand more sacrifice, could shoot its own soldiers for retreating, could operate with brutality that matched and sometimes exceeded the Nazi brutality. The collision of these two systems created conditions where normal constraints on warfare disappeared, where both sides committed atrocities, where the suffering reached levels that other theaters never approached. The combination of factors created the catastrophe. The vast distances, the extreme climate, the ideological commitment, the totalitarian systems on both sides, the total war that recognized no limits. Each factor was significant alone. Together they multiplied, created conditions beyond what any single factor could produce, created the most brutal battlefield in human history, created casualties that exceeded 30 million, created suffering that lasted 4 years, created destruction that took decades to repair and some things that could never be repaired, created the Eastern Front. Dawn came early on June 22nd, 1941. The summer sun rose over the Soviet-German border, along a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, over 2,000 kilometers. Along this entire front, simultaneously, the invasion began. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by another 600,000 soldiers from Axis allies. Italy, Romania, Hungary, Finland. The force was unprecedented. The goal was to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign. Before winter, Hitler predicted the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards. The invasion was organized into 3 army groups. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, aimed for Leningrad. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, drove toward Moscow. Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, targeted Ukraine and the oil fields beyond. Each army group had specific objectives, specific routes, specific timetables. The planning had been extensive, the preparations massive. The confidence was high. Army Group North consisted of approximately 26 divisions, 3 panzer divisions, 3 motorized divisions, 20 infantry divisions. The objective was Leningrad, Russia's second city, the Baltic coast. The route took the army group through Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, through the Baltic states that Soviet Union had occupied in 1940. The terrain was difficult. Forests, swamps, limited roads. But the advance was expected to succeed, was expected to reach Leningrad within weeks. Army Group Center was the most powerful. 50 divisions, 9 panzer divisions, 6 motorized divisions, 35 infantry divisions. The concentration of armor was unprecedented. The objective was Moscow, the capital, the heart of Soviet Union. The route was through Białystok, through Minsk, through Smolensk. The terrain was mixed. Some forests, some open ground. Better than the north, but still challenging. The timetable assumed Moscow would fall before autumn. The assumption would prove wrong. Army Group South had approximately 40 divisions, 5 panzer divisions, 3 motorized divisions, 32 infantry divisions, plus Romanian forces. The objective was Ukraine, the breadbasket, the industrial region, the route toward the oil fields of the Caucasus beyond. The terrain in the south was more favorable. Open steppe, good tank country. The advance was expected to be rapid, was expected to achieve deep penetrations. The expectations would be met initially, then challenged. The Luftwaffe committed nearly 3,000 aircraft to support the invasion. Bombers, fighters, dive bombers. The goal was to destroy the Soviet Air Force on the ground, to achieve air superiority immediately, to support the ground advance with close air support. The Luftwaffe attacks began at dawn, struck Soviet airfields. The Soviet aircraft were parked in the open, were lined up, were easy targets. Hundreds were destroyed before they could take off. The surprise was complete. The destruction was enormous. Soviet air power was crippled in the first hours. The initial German advance was devastating. Soviet forces were caught unprepared. Stalin had dismissed intelligence warnings about German buildup. British intelligence had warned. Soviet intelligence had warned. Even German deserters had warned. Crossed the lines. Reported the invasion was imminent. Stalin refused to believe. Feared provoking Hitler. Believed the Germans wouldn't attack yet. Was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The Soviet forces on the border were deployed forward, were vulnerable to encirclement. The German tactic was proven, was effective. Panzer spearheads would penetrate deep, would circle behind Soviet formations, would trap them in the pockets. Infantry would follow, would reduce the pockets, would capture or kill the encircled forces. The Soviet command structure collapsed in the first days. Communications were cut. Headquarters were overrun. Commanders lost contact with their units, lost understanding of the situation. The chaos was total. Some Soviet units fought fiercely, held positions, inflicted casualties, delayed the advance. Other units retreated in disorder. Some surrendered. Some dissolved. The soldiers scattered, tried to escape east, tried to reach Soviet lines. Many were captured. Many died trying. Stalin's initial reaction was paralysis, was denial. The first reports of invasion reached Moscow at dawn. Stalin didn't believe them, thought they were provocations, thought German units were acting without authorization. The scale of the invasion became clear within hours. Stalin still hesitated, gave no orders, made no decisions. The paralysis lasted days. The Soviet military operated without clear direction, without coordination. The chaos was worsened by Stalin's absence from decision-making, by the void at the top. Stalin eventually recovered, assumed command. But the first days were lost, were critical. The delay cost Soviet forces dearly. The first major encirclement occurred at Białystok, Minsk, within 3 weeks of the invasion. Army Group Center's panzers penetrated hundreds of kilometers. The 2nd Panzer Group under General Heinz Guderian drove northeast from Brest. The 3rd Panzer Group under General Hermann Hoth drove southeast from East Prussia. The 2 Panzer Groups met east of Minsk, created massive pocket, trapped Soviet forces around Białystok and Minsk. The pocket contained multiple Soviet armies, the 3rd Army, the 10th Army, parts of the 4th Army. Over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. The scale of the defeat was staggering. Entire armies ceased to exist. The Soviet command structure in this region fragmented completely. The reduction of the Białystok-Minsk pocket took 2 weeks. The encircled Soviet forces fought desperately, tried to break out. Some units succeeded. Most didn't. The German infantry divisions closed the pocket, compressed it. Artillery bombarded the trapped forces. The Luftwaffe bombed them. The conditions inside the pocket deteriorated rapidly. Food ran out. Ammunition was exhausted. Medical supplies were gone. The wounded suffered. The dead accumulated. Eventually, the organized resistance collapsed. The survivors surrendered, were marched into captivity, into prisoner camps, where most would die. The Battle of Smolensk in July and August continued the pattern. Another massive encirclement. Army Group Center's panzers again drove deep, created another pocket, another 300,000 Soviet casualties. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. The tactics were working. The advance continued, but the pace was slowing. The Soviet resistance was becoming more organized. The pockets were taking longer to reduce. The German forces were becoming tired, were becoming worn. The continuous combat, the continuous advance, was taking toll. The advance was measured in kilometers per day initially. 50 kilometers, 60. The rate was extraordinary, was unprecedented, but began slowing. 40 kilometers per day, 30, 20. The resistance was stiffening, the distances were telling, the logistics was straining, the mechanical failures were increasing. The infantry was exhausted from continuous marching. The advance continued, but was slowing, was becoming more difficult. The easy victories were ending, the hard fighting was beginning, but problems were emerging that would prove decisive. The distances were vast, far vaster than anything German forces had encountered in France or Poland. The supply lines stretched. The logistical system was based on European infrastructure, European road networks, European rail gauges. The Soviet Union had different rail gauge. Required conversion of track or transshipment of supplies. The process was slow, the capacity was limited. The advancing forces outran their supply lines. Ammunition was short, fuel was short. Food was adequate, but not abundant. The soldiers were already tired, already stressed, already showing the strain of continuous advance across vast distances. The roads were poor, often unpaved. The summer dust choked engines. Clouds of dust followed every vehicle. The dust got into everything, into engines, into mechanisms, into lungs. The mechanical failures increased. The air filters clogged. The engines overheated. Replacement parts were scarce, had to be brought forward across the stretched supply lines. Vehicles broke down and were abandoned. The panzer divisions that had started with hundreds of tanks were reduced to dozens of operational vehicles, not from combat primarily, from mechanical attrition. From where? From the environment. The vaunted German mechanized forces were being degraded by geography and logistics before Soviet resistance had seriously affected them. The horses suffered terribly. The Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horses for logistics, for artillery transport. Each infantry division had thousands of horses. The horses had to be fed, required fodder, required water. The long marches exhausted them. The heat stressed them. Many died, collapsed on the roads, were shot, were left behind. The loss of horses reduced mobility, reduced logistics capacity, made everything harder. The image of Wehrmacht as fully mechanized force was myth. Most supplies were moved by horse-drawn wagons. The horses were dying. The logistics were failing. The Soviet scorched earth policy complicated German logistics further. Stalin ordered retreating forces to destroy everything, burn crops, demolish factories, destroy bridges, mine roads, leave nothing for the enemy. The policy was implemented ruthlessly. Political officers and NKVD troops enforced it. Shot those who hesitated, shot those who refused. The advancing Germans found devastation, found burned villages, found destroyed bridges, found fields on fire, found nothing to requisition, had to rely entirely on their overstretched supply lines. The policy was brutal for Soviet civilians, left them with nothing, condemned many to starvation, but denied resources to the enemy, slowed their advance, made occupation more difficult, made exploitation of conquered territory nearly impossible. Soviet resistance was chaotic, but often fierce. Many units fought desperately even when surrounded, even when cut off from command, even when defeat was certain. The resistance cost time, cost German casualties, cost equipment. Each encircled pocket required infantry to reduce it, tied down forces, delayed the advance. The fighting in the pockets was close, was brutal. The Soviet soldiers knew they were doomed, fought anyway. Some sought to delay, to buy time for others to escape, to organize. Some fought from desperation, from fear of capture, from knowledge that surrender meant death in camps. Some fought from courage, from duty, from refusal to surrender. The reasons varied. The result was same. The pockets took time to reduce. The time bought was valuable, was costly to Germans. The Soviet soldiers were poorly led often in these first weeks. The officer corps had been devastated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. Experienced commanders had been executed, had been sent to camps, had been removed. The remaining officers were often inexperienced, often political appointees, often incompetent. The tactical leadership was poor. The coordination was absent, but the soldiers fought, died in enormous numbers, but fought. The resistance wasn't organized, wasn't coordinated, but was continuous, was wearing, was costly to Germans in time and casualties and equipment. The weather began changing in September. The summer heat gave way to autumn rain. The Rasputitsa began. The season of mud. The unpaved roads turned to glutinous masses. Vehicles bogged down, couldn't move. Horses sank to their bellies. Men marched through mud to their knees. The advance slowed, dramatically. In some sectors, stopped completely. The armies waited for the ground to freeze, waited for conditions that would allow movement. The delay was measured in weeks, was critical. Gave Soviet forces time to organize, time to bring reserves from Siberia, time to prepare defenses, time to dig trenches around Moscow, time that the Germans couldn't afford to give. The delay meant that winter would arrive before Moscow fell, before Leningrad fell, before the campaign objectives were achieved. The German forces had not prepared for winter campaign, had planned for quick victory, for collapse of Soviet resistance by autumn, had not brought winter clothing in quantities needed, had not winterized equipment, had not prepared for temperatures that would drop to 40 below. The assumption of quick victory was proving wrong. The cost of that assumption would be paid in the coming winter. But in autumn of 1941, the Germans were still advancing, were still winning tactically. were still encircling Soviet armies, were still moving toward objectives. The confidence remained. The belief in imminent victory remained. Army Group North was besieging Leningrad. Army Group Center was approaching Moscow. Could see the Kremlin spires through binoculars on clear days. Army Group South was overrunning Ukraine, captured Kiev, created another massive encirclement, another 500,000 Soviet casualties. The Soviet Union had lost millions of soldiers, had lost vast territories, appeared to be losing the war, but was still fighting, was still resisting, was still denying the Germans the quick, decisive victory they needed. The Red Army was battered, was broken in many places, but was still there, was still functioning, was bringing forces forward, was organizing defenses, was preparing counterattacks. The Soviet Union had depth, had reserves, had population that could be mobilized, had factories that were being evacuated east, beyond German reach. The resilience was unexpected, was underestimated, was proving to be decisive. The invasion that was supposed to end before winter was continuing into winter. The invasion that was supposed to be easy was proving to be harder than anticipated. The distances were proving to be more significant than expected. The logistics were proving to be inadequate. The Soviet Union was proving to be more resilient than Hitler had predicted. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, was worn, was still advancing, but at cost, at pace that was unsustainable. The catastrophe was just beginning. The easy victories of summer were ending. The hard fighting of autumn was beginning. The winter disaster was approaching. Operation Barbarossa was succeeding tactically, was failing strategically. The quick victory wasn't happening. The war would continue, would extend into winter, into next year, into catastrophe that would consume millions, that would destroy armies, that would prove Hitler's prediction wrong. The Soviet Union wasn't house of cards, was vast nation with depth and reserves and determination, was nation that would survive, that would fight, that would eventually win. But the cost would be beyond anything imaginable, would be measured in millions dead, in cities destroyed, in nation devastated. The invasion was just beginning. The catastrophe was just beginning. The most brutal battlefield in human history was just beginning. The winter of 1941 to 42 arrived early. November brought cold. December brought temperatures that dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, -4 Fahrenheit. By January, temperatures were regularly -30, -22 Fahrenheit. In some areas, temperatures dropped to -40, -40 Celsius or Fahrenheit. The scales converge at that temperature. At 40 below, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath freezes. Metal becomes brittle. Machinery stops functioning. The cold becomes enemy to everyone, to Germans and Soviets both. But the Germans suffered more, suffered because they were unprepared. The Wehrmacht had planned for summer campaign, had planned for victory before winter. The initial invasion force had summer uniforms, light clothing, adequate for summer, inadequate for temperatures below freezing. The supply priority had been ammunition and fuel. Winter gear was low priority, was assumed to be unnecessary. When winter arrived, the soldiers didn't have what they needed, didn't have winter coats, didn't have proper boots, didn't have gloves adequate for extreme cold, had to improvise. The improvisation took many forms. Soldiers wore multiple layers of summer uniforms, stuffed newspapers under their clothes for insulation, wrapped their feet in newspaper, in straw, in anything that might provide warmth, took clothing from dead soldiers, from dead Soviet soldiers, from civilians. The scavenging for warm clothing became survival necessity. The lucky ones found Russian winter gear, fur hats, felt boots, padded jackets, wore them over German uniforms. The unlucky ones froze. The frostbite was epidemic, thousands of cases, Tens of thousands. Fingers froze, toes froze, ears froze, noses froze. The frostbitten tissue died, turned black, had to be amputated. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with frostbite casualties. More casualties from cold than from combat in some units. The medical staff couldn't treat everyone, couldn't save all the frozen digits. Soldiers lost fingers, lost toes, lost feet, were sent to rear areas, were no longer effective combat troops. The cold was removing soldiers from combat as effectively as Soviet bullets. The weapons froze. The metal contracted in the cold. The mechanisms jammed. Rifles wouldn't fire. Machine guns wouldn't cycle. The lubricants froze, became thick, prevented moving parts from moving. The soldiers learned to keep weapons inside their clothing, against their bodies, using body heat to keep mechanisms warm enough to function. But this was exhausting, was uncomfortable, wasn't always possible. Sometimes the weapons just didn't work. The soldiers faced combat with weapons that might not fire, with equipment that was failing because of temperature. The vehicles wouldn't start. The engines were designed for European temperatures, not for 40 below. The oil became thick. The fuel gelled. The batteries lost power in the cold. Starting engines required fires. Beneath them, required warming the oil, warming the engine blocks. The process took time, took fuel, often failed. Vehicles that had survived combat, that had survived mechanical stress, stopped running because of cold, were abandoned, were left beside roads. The panzer divisions and motorized infantry were losing mobility, were being reduced to infantry, were walking because their vehicles wouldn't run. The cold affected everything. The horses suffered. Thousands of horses died from exposure, from lack of fodder. The Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horses for logistics. For artillery transport, the loss of horses meant loss of mobility, meant supplies couldn't move forward, meant artillery couldn't move. The logistics system was already strained. The cold made it worse, made it nearly impossible. The living conditions were brutal. German soldiers huddled in inadequate shelters, in captured buildings when available, in foxholes and trenches when not. The buildings offered some protection from wind, some shelter, but often lacked heating. The glass was often broken, the walls damaged, the roofs compromised, the cold penetrated. Soldiers slept fully dressed, wore all available clothing, huddled together for warmth. Still froze. The night was particularly brutal. The temperature dropped further. The darkness seemed endless. The suffering was immense. The Soviet forces had winter equipment. Fur hats called ushankas, felt boots called valenki, padded jackets. The equipment was designed for Russian winter, was adequate when supplied properly. But supply was inconsistent. Not all units received full issue. Some soldiers still lacked proper gear, still suffered from cold, still developed frostbite, still froze. The Soviet military advantage in winter wasn't that their soldiers were immune to cold, was that they were better equipped, better prepared, more accustomed to these conditions. But the cold still killed, still injured, still made everything harder. The Soviet counteroffensive began in December. Outside Moscow, Soviet forces attacked German positions. The Germans were weakened by cold, by exhaustion, by overstretched supply lines. The Soviet attacks made progress, pushed Germans back, recovered territory. The psychological impact was significant. The Wehrmacht was retreating. For the first time in the war, was being pushed backward. The myth of invincibility was breaking. The realization that the campaign hadn't succeeded, that Moscow wouldn't fall, that the war would continue. The realization was bitter, was demoralizing. The retreat in winter was nightmare. German units fell back, tried to establish new defensive lines. But the cold continued. The suffering continued. Wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated froze. Soldiers who fell asleep in the open froze. The retreat left trails of abandoned equipment, of frozen bodies, of evidence of catastrophe. The Wehrmacht that had crossed the border in June as seemingly invincible force was retreating in December as exhausted. Frozen, broken formation. The winter killed Germans in numbers that exceeded combat casualties in many units. The estimates vary, but suggest that hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were lost to cold-related causes. Frostbite casualties, freezing deaths, disease related to weakened condition from cold. The winter of 41 to 42 was catastrophe for the Wehrmacht, was preview of what sustained campaign in Soviet Union would mean, was demonstration that environment could be as deadly as combat, that preparation mattered, that assumptions about quick victory had been wrong, that the cost of those wrong assumptions was paid in frozen soldiers, in lost equipment, in shattered confidence. The winter ended eventually. The cold moderated, but the damage was done. The Wehrmacht's strength was reduced. The Soviet Union had survived. The war would continue. The catastrophe was accelerating. Leningrad stood on the Baltic coast, Russia's second city. Population over 2.5 million. Cultural center, industrial center, city of Peter the Great. German Army Group North approached in September 1941. Finnish forces approached from the north. The goal was to capture the city, to eliminate it as Soviet base. Hitler issued orders. Leningrad was to be surrounded, was to be starved into submission. The German military was ordered not to accept surrender, not to enter the city, just to surround it. Cut it off. Let starvation do the work. The policy was deliberate, was calculation, was a murder by siege. The encirclement closed in September. Land routes to the city were cut. The population was trapped. Over 2 million civilians, plus approximately 200,000 soldiers defending the perimeter. The city's food reserves were limited, were calculated to last weeks, not months, not years. The rations were reduced immediately. Everyone received ration cards. Workers received more. Dependents received less. Children received the minimum. The arithmetic of survival began. The calculations of how long food would last, how many people would die. The numbers weren't secret, weren't hidden. Everyone understood that the food was running out, that starvation was coming. By November, the daily ration for dependents and children was reduced to 125 grams of bread. 4 ounces. The bread wasn't real bread. Was made from whatever could be ground into flour. Included sawdust, included cellulose, included substitutes that had minimal nutrition. The caloric content was perhaps 500 calories. A human body at rest requires approximately 1,200 calories daily. A human body working or exposed to cold requires more. 1,500, 2,000. The ration wasn't sufficient, wasn't close to sufficient. The mathematics was simple. Brutal. On this ration, people would starve. The question was only how long it would take. The starvation began in earnest in November, continued through winter. The effects were progressive. First, the body burned fat reserves. People became thin, gaunt. Then the body burned muscle, consumed itself for energy. People became weak, could barely walk. Work became impossible. The body shut down non-essential functions. Reproduction stopped. Women stopped menstruating. The body prioritized survival. Core functions, heart, lungs, brain. Everything else was sacrificed. Eventually, even these failed. The heart weakened. The person died, usually quietly, usually in sleep. The starvation wasn't dramatic, wasn't violent, was just slow cessation, slow dimming, slow death. The winter of 41 to 42 was particularly brutal. The cold compounded the starvation. The starving body couldn't generate heat, couldn't maintain temperature. People froze while they starved. The combination was deadly. The death toll climbed, thousands daily. By some estimates, 10,000 per day at the peak. The city couldn't bury the dead, couldn't process the bodies. They accumulated in apartments, in hallways, in streets, covered by snow, frozen solid, waited for spring, for ground to thaw enough to dig graves. The city of the living became city of the dead. The suffering was total. Families watched each other die. Parents watched children die. Children watched parents die. The helplessness was complete. No amount of care, no amount of love could change the arithmetic, could provide calories that didn't exist. Some families made terrible choices. Who got food when there wasn't enough? Who survived? Who didn't? The choices haunted survivors. The guilt lasted lifetimes. The moral catastrophe matched the physical catastrophe. The road of life provided some relief. Not enough, but some. Lake Ladoga separated Leningrad from Soviet-held territory to the east. In winter, the lake froze. Trucks could drive across the ice, could bring supplies, could evacuate people. The route was dangerous. German artillery shelled the ice. German aircraft bombed the trucks. The ice itself was treacherous, shifted, cracked. Trucks broke through, sank, drivers died. But the route operated, brought food, brought ammunition, evacuated children, evacuated the sick, the most vulnerable. The route couldn't supply the city adequately, couldn't bring enough food for 2 million people, but brought enough to keep the city alive. Barely. To reduce the death rate from catastrophic to merely terrible. In summer, boats crossed the lake, under fire, under air attack. The capacity was limited, less than trucks on ice, but the route remained open, remained the city's lifeline, the only connection to the outside world, the only source of supply. The road of life was accurately named. Was life itself for Leningrad? Without it, the city would have died completely. Everyone would have starved. With it, hundreds of thousands starved instead of millions. The calculation was grim, was realistic, was all that was possible. The siege continued through 1942. The worst was over. The death rate declined. Rations increased slightly. People adapted, learned to survive on minimal calories, learned to conserve energy, learned not to hope too much, not to think too far ahead, just to survive the day. Then the next day. The psychological adaptation was remarkable, was necessary. Those who couldn't adapt, who couldn't accept the reality, who couldn't function in the nightmare, died sooner. The survivors were those who could endure, who could suppress emotion, who could reduce existence to simple continuation, to breathing, to surviving, to waiting for the siege to end. The siege was finally broken in January 1944. Soviet offensives opened corridor to the city. The blockade ended. Supply improved. Food increased. The immediate threat of starvation ended. But the damage was done. Over 1 million Leningrad civilians died during the siege. The estimates vary. Some say 800,000. Some say over 1 million. The exact number is uncertain. Record-keeping was imperfect. Many died unrecorded, but the general scale is accepted. Approximately 1 million died. Most from starvation, most slowly, most while the world went on, while the war continued elsewhere, while they waited for relief that came too late for them. The survivors were marked permanently, physically damaged by months or years of starvation, psychologically damaged by witnessing death on such scale, by making choices no one should make, by losing everyone. Many survivors had lost entire families, parents, siblings, children, everyone. The loneliness was profound. The trauma lasted lifetimes. The siege of Leningrad was murder by arithmetic, was calculated, was policy. Hitler wanted the city destroyed, wanted the population eliminated, came close to succeeding. The siege lasted 872 days, over 2.5 years, was longest siege in modern history, was demonstration of what modern war could do to cities, to civilians, was evidence that technological warfare could create suffering on scales previously unimaginable. Leningrad survived. The city didn't die, but 1 million of its people did. Died slowly, died from mathematics, from rations that couldn't sustain life, from cold that weakened, from disease that flourished in weakened bodies, from starvation. That was policy. That was weapon. That was how Hitler chose to destroy a city without entering it. The siege of Leningrad stands as monument to human capacity to inflict suffering, to capacity to endure suffering, to the terrible cost of total war. The city was called Stalingrad, bore Stalin's name, sat on the Volga River, was industrial center, was transportation hub, was strategically important for controlling river traffic, for access to oil fields in the Caucasus beyond, was psychologically important because of its name, was target that Germany wanted to capture, was city that Stalin ordered must be defended. The collision of these imperatives created battle that lasted 6 months, that killed over 1 million people, that destroyed the city completely. That became symbol of the war's brutality. The battle began in August 1942. German 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus attacked. The initial assault came from the west. German forces advanced toward the city. Soviet forces under General Vasily Chuikov defended. The initial fighting was conventional, mobile warfare, tank battles, artillery duels. The Germans advanced. The Soviets retreated, slowly, fighting for every position, delaying, buying time. The city wasn't immediately threatened, was visible in the distance, was the objective, was where the battle would be decided. By September, the fighting reached the city's outskirts, then entered the city proper. The nature of the combat changed. Urban warfare was different from open combat. The buildings provided cover, provided defensive positions. The rubble created obstacles. The streets channeled attacks. The attackers' advantages, tanks, artillery, air power, were reduced. The defenders' advantages, fortified positions, short engagement ranges, intimate knowledge of terrain, increased. The fighting became grinding, became attrition, became battle measured in buildings rather than kilometers. The German Luftwaffe bombed the city systematically, reduced districts to rubble. The bombing was intended to destroy Soviet defensive positions, intended to create panic, to force evacuation, had opposite effect. The rubble created defensive terrain. The ruins provided countless positions for defenders. The Soviet soldiers fought from basements, from shell craters, from collapsed buildings. The rubble favored defense, made attack costly. The German bombing created the battlefield that made German advance most difficult. The Soviet tactic was to hug the enemy, to stay close to German lines, meters away, tens of meters. The tactic prevented German use of artillery and air support. If Soviet positions were meters from German positions, the Germans couldn't shell or bomb without hitting their own troops. The tactic worked, forced Germans to fight at close range, to advance building by building, room by room, floor by floor. The advance was measured in meters. Each meter cost casualties. Each building cost days or weeks to capture. The fighting was continuous, day and night, without pause. Soldiers fought with rifles, with grenades, with knives, with entrenching tools, at distances of meters, sometimes hand to hand. The intimacy of the violence was total. You saw the enemy's face. Fought in the same room, the same hallway. The psychological toll was immense. The physical toll was worse. Soldiers were killed, were wounded, continued fighting wounded, fought until they couldn't, then were replaced. The replacements fought until they were killed or wounded. The cycle repeated. The battle consumed men, ground them down, replaced them with fresh men who were also ground down. The Volga River behind the city was Soviet lifeline. Reinforcements crossed at night, under fire. German artillery shelled the crossing points. German aircraft bombed the boats. Many boats were sunk. Many soldiers died in the crossing. Never reached the city. The survivors crossed. Reinforced the defense. Brought ammunition. Brought food. Brought the supplies that kept the defense functioning. The crossing was nightly agony. Was necessary. Was continuous. Without it, the defense would collapse. With it, the defense continued. The battle continued. The dying continued. The Soviet reinforcement strategy was deliberate. Fresh divisions crossed the Volga, entered combat, were reduced to fractions of strength within days, were pulled out when depleted. New divisions crossed. The strategy maintained continuous presence in the city, maintained defensive strength, but consumed divisions rapidly. The reinforcement rate had to match the loss rate. The loss rate was extraordinary. Divisions of 10,000 men were reduced to 1,000 or fewer, were considered combat ineffective, were withdrawn. New divisions arrived. The mathematics were brutal, were unsustainable long-term, but sustained long enough. The fighting continued through September, through October, through November. The German advance slowed, measured in buildings, sometimes in rooms. The Sixth Army was being ground down. The divisions entered at full strength, were reduced to remnants. The replacements came, were also ground down. The Soviet divisions were similarly depleted. The battle was mutual destruction. Both sides fed forces into the city. Both sides lost them. The question was, which side could sustain the losses longer? Which side would break first? The city was destroyed. Systematically. Completely. The bombing, the shelling, the fighting, all contributed. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Buildings that had stood for decades, for centuries, were gone, were piles of broken stone and twisted metal. The fires burned continuously. The smoke obscured the sky. The smell was overwhelming. Cordite, burning, decay. The bodies couldn't all be recovered, couldn't all be buried, lay in the rubble. Thousands of bodies, civilians and soldiers both. The city became necropolis, became place where the living fought among the dead, where survival itself seemed impossible, where it continued anyway. The workers in the city's factories continued producing, worked while battles raged nearby. The Barricadi factory, the Red October factory, the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. These weren't just factories, were fortresses, were positions in the defensive line. Workers produced tanks and weapons during the day, defended the factories at night. The line between civilian and soldier blurred. Everyone fought, everyone was at risk, everyone was target. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant disappeared in the ruins. The temperature dropped in November. Winter arrived. The fighting continued in the cold, in the snow. The ruined buildings offered some shelter from wind, but were unheated, were open to the elements. The soldiers fought in temperatures below freezing. The wounded often froze before they could be evacuated. The bodies froze, became part of the landscape. The cold added to all the other miseries, made everything harder, made survival even less likely. By November, the German advance had stalled. The Sixth Army held most of the city, but couldn't capture it all. The Soviet forces held a strip along the Volga, held positions that wouldn't break, wouldn't collapse. The German command considered the battle won, considered it just a matter of time. Was wrong. The time would never come. The final push would never succeed. The battle had reached equilibrium. had become stalemate. The casualties continued mounting. The city continued being destroyed. But the outcome was frozen, was undecided, was waiting for something to break the stalemate. The break came from outside. In late November, Soviet forces attacked north and south of Stalingrad, attacked the Romanian armies protecting the German flanks. The Romanian forces were less well-equipped than Germans, were spread thin, were vulnerable. The Soviet offensive broke through. The two pincers, north and south, advanced rapidly, met west of Stalingrad, closed the circle. The German Sixth Army was encircled. Approximately 290,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped. The hunters had become the hunted. The besiegers had become the besieged. The battle's dynamics inverted in a moment. The trapped forces now faced the same question the Soviets had faced. Break out or hold. Fight or surrender. Survive or die. The Stalingrad encirclement would become its own catastrophe. Its own story, the battle for the city. The battle that had consumed divisions, that had killed hundreds of thousands, that had destroyed the city completely. That battle was ending, but the catastrophe was continuing, was transforming into something different, into death by siege, into starvation and cold and slow elimination. The city that had become hell was becoming tomb. The soldiers who had fought for months among the ruins were about to discover that the ruins could become even worse, that the battle could intensify even as movement stopped, that the catastrophe could deepen even as the fighting became static. Stalingrad was becoming symbol, was becoming name that meant ultimate brutality, was becoming evidence of what happened when total war met urban terrain, when ideology met geography. When surrender wasn't option, when retreat wasn't possible, when survival depended on endurance beyond human limits. The battle for the city was ending. The dying was just beginning. The German Sixth Army was trapped. The Soviet pincers had closed west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. 290,000 German and Axis soldiers were inside the pocket, cut off from their supply lines, cut off from reinforcement, surrounded by Soviet forces. The situation was desperate. The options were two: break out or hold position and wait for relief. Hitler's decision was immediate, was unequivocal. The Sixth Army would hold, would not retreat, would wait for relief. The order was given, was obeyed. The consequences would be catastrophic. The pocket's dimensions were approximately 50 kilometers east to west, 30 kilometers north to south, roughly 30 miles by 20 miles. Inside this area, the trapped forces had to survive, had to hold their positions, had to wait. The winter was arriving, the temperature was dropping. The supplies inside the pocket were limited. Food for perhaps a week, ammunition for heavy fighting for a few days. Fuel for vehicles for perhaps a week. Medical supplies were already short. The arithmetic was clear. The pocket couldn't sustain itself. Required resupply. Required relief. Required something to break the encirclement. The Luftwaffe promised to supply the pocket by air. Hermann Göring assured Hitler that air supply was possible. The calculation was that the pocket required 500 tons of supplies daily. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, replacement parts, 500 tons every day. The Luftwaffe had never supplied by air on this scale, had never sustained such an airlift. But the promise was made. The plan was adopted. The Sixth Army would hold, the Luftwaffe would supply. Relief would come eventually. The plan was based on optimism, was based on assumptions, was based on wishful thinking more than capability. The air supply failed from the beginning. The Luftwaffe couldn't deliver 500 tons daily. The best days saw 100 tons delivered. Most days saw far less, 50 tons, 20 tons. Some days, nothing arrived. Bad weather grounded flights. Soviet fighters intercepted transports. shot them down. The slow Ju-52 transports were vulnerable, were easy targets for Soviet fighters. Soviet anti-aircraft fire was intense around the airfields. The transports had to fly through flak. Many were hit. Many crashed. The losses of aircraft and crews mounted. The supply effort continued but couldn't meet requirements, couldn't approach what was needed. The gap between required and delivered grew daily. The food situation became critical immediately. The rations were reduced, from already minimal levels, reduced again as supplies failed to arrive. By December, the daily ration was below subsistence level, was insufficient to maintain body weight, insufficient to maintain strength. The soldiers were slowly starving. The bread ration dropped to 100 grams daily, 3.5 ounces, sometimes less, sometimes none. The soup was watery, had minimal nutrition. The caloric intake was perhaps 700 calories daily. A man at rest requires 1,200. A soldier in combat requires more, 2,000, 3,000 in extreme cold. The deficit was enormous, was deadly. The body consumed itself. The horses were slaughtered for food. The army had thousands of horses, for artillery transport, for logistics. The horses became food source, were killed systematically. The meat was distributed, provided temporary relief, was better than nothing. The horse meat lasted weeks, but the horses were finite, were gone by late December. Then the starvation accelerated. There was nothing left to eat. The rations continued dropping. The soldiers grew weaker, hungrier, more desperate. Some soldiers ate things that weren't food. Leather from boots, belts, anything that could be chewed. Some ate grass when they could find it under snow. The desperation was total. The hunger was overwhelming, dominated everything, made thinking difficult, made functioning difficult. The weakened soldiers could barely perform duties, could barely fight, could barely survive. The hierarchy of who got food became important, became determinant of survival. The combat troops received more, the wounded received less. The support troops received minimal. The officers sometimes received more, sometimes didn't. The system broke down as supplies disappeared. Everyone starved, just at different rates. The cold was the other enemy. December temperatures dropped below -20 Celsius, -4 Fahrenheit. January was colder, -30, -40. The soldiers had some winter gear by now, more than they'd had the previous winter, but still inadequate for these temperatures. For living in the open, for sustained exposure. The winter coats helped, the felt boots helped, but weren't enough. The frostbite continued. The cold injuries accumulated. Soldiers lost fingers, lost toes, lost effectiveness. The cold and starvation combined were deadly. The starving body couldn't generate heat, couldn't maintain temperature, froze easier, died easier. The combination was lethal, was killing faster than either alone would have. The living conditions inside the pocket deteriorated progressively. Initially, there was some organization, some structure. The units maintained positions, maintained discipline, as supplies dwindled, as the cold intensified. As the starvation progressed, the structure eroded, the discipline weakened. Men stopped caring about minor rules, about appearance, about protocol, cared only about survival, about warmth, about food. The focus narrowed. The concerns became immediate. Nothing else mattered. The bunkers and dugouts where soldiers sheltered were overcrowded, were inadequate protection from cold. The walls were earth. The roofs were timber and earth. The heating was minimal. Small fires when fuel could be found, when wood could be scavenged. The smoke filled the bunkers, made breathing difficult, made eyes water. But the fires provided some warmth, some comfort. Soldiers huddled around fires, tried to sleep in shifts, close to fires for warmth. The nights were worst, the temperature dropped, the fires often went out, the cold penetrated. Sleep was difficult, was interrupted constantly, was inadequate. The exhaustion accumulated. The wounded suffered worst. The medical facilities inside the pocket were overwhelmed. The supplies were exhausted rapidly. Bandages, morphine, antibiotics, anesthetics, everything ran out. The wounded lay on floors, in unheated buildings, in the open sometimes, without adequate care, without pain relief. Many died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper care. Died slowly, in agony. The medical staff could do nothing, could only witness, could only make comfortable when possible. Most of the time, comfort wasn't possible. The medical staff themselves were starving, were freezing, were dying, could barely function. The medical system collapsed. The wounded died in enormous numbers. The soldiers wrote letters. Last letters, knowing they wouldn't survive, wouldn't see families again. The letters were collected, were supposed to be flown out. Many were never sent, were found later, after the war. The letters are preserved, are evidence of final thoughts, of what mattered at the end. The letters spoke of love, of regret, of hope that families would understand, would remember them, would survive. The letters were often simple, were direct, said what needed to be said. The soldiers knew they were dying, wanted to leave something, some final word, some proof they had existed, had mattered. The morale deteriorated as hope faded. Initially, soldiers believed relief would come, believed Luftwaffe would supply adequately, believed pocket would be saved. The belief sustained them, gave purpose, gave reason to endure. As days passed, as weeks passed, as supplies didn't arrive, as relief didn't come, the hope died. The soldiers understood they were abandoned, were sacrificed, would die in the pocket. The realization was crushing, was demoralizing. Some soldiers stopped fighting, stopped caring, waited for death. Others continued, maintained duty, maintained position, from habit, from discipline, from refusal to quit even when hopeless. The Soviet forces compressed the pocket gradually, attacked from all sides, pushed inward. The pocket shrank. The trapped forces were compressed into smaller area. The density increased, made Soviet artillery more effective, made every shell more likely to hit something, someone. The casualties mounted, from combat, from cold, from starvation, from disease. Typhus spread in the unsanitary conditions. Dysentery was epidemic. The weakened bodies couldn't resist infection. The disease killed, added to all the other causes. The death rate climbed, hundreds daily at first, then thousands daily. The bodies accumulated, couldn't all be buried. The ground was frozen. Digging was impossible. Bodies were stacked, were left where they fell, would be buried when ground thawed, if anyone remained to bury them. The relief effort failed. A German force under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attacked from the south in December. Operation Winter Storm. The relief force consisted of 3 panzer divisions, additional infantry. The attack began December 12th, advanced rapidly initially, covered half the distance to the pocket, got within 50 kilometers, within 30 miles, could go no further. The Soviet defenses held. The relief force was stopped, was pushed back. Fuel ran out. Supplies were insufficient. The attack failed completely by December 23rd. The attempt was over. The pocket remained trapped, remained surrounded. The hope of relief died completely. General Paulus requested permission to break out, to abandon Stalingrad, to fight west toward Manstein's forces. The breakout would cost heavily, would require abandoning wounded, abandoning equipment, but might save core of the army, might save some men. Hitler refused. ordered 6th Army to hold, to wait for renewed relief attempt. The order condemned the army, made survival impossible. Paulus obeyed. The army stayed, continued dying. January brought worse cold, brought final Soviet offensives. The pocket was split, cut in two. The northern part, the southern part, isolated from each other. Each fought separately, each died separately. The end was approaching, was visible, was inevitable. The soldiers understood, knew they were dying. Some maintained discipline, maintained position, fought to the end. Others collapsed psychologically, stopped fighting, stopped caring, waited for death or capture. The breakdown was progressive, was unit by unit, was individual by individual. The army was dying, not just physically, but as organization, as coherent force. The structure was dissolving, the units were disintegrating, the army was becoming a collection of starving, freezing, dying individuals. The last days were nightmare. Food was completely gone, water was scarce, the cold was extreme, the fighting continued. Soviet forces pressed, attacked continuously. The defensive lines collapsed, fell back, compressed into smaller spaces. The suffering was total. The despair was complete. Some soldiers committed suicide, couldn't endure anymore, chose death over continued suffering. The suicides were common, were unremarkable, were understandable. The alternative was starvation, was freezing, was slow death. Quick death had appeal. General Paulus surrendered the southern pocket January 31st. Hitler had promoted him to field marshal the day before. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was hint, was suggestion. Paulus ignored it. Surrendered anyway. Chose survival over suicide. The northern pocket surrendered February 2nd. The survivors went into Soviet captivity. Approximately 91,000 soldiers surrendered. Of the 290,000 who had been encircled, 91,000 survived to surrender. The rest died in the pocket, from combat, from starvation, from cold, from disease, from all causes. The survival rate was approximately 30%. 7 in 10 died in the pocket. Never left, were buried in mass graves, or left unburied. Bodies that would be found when the snow melted, would be found for decades after. The survivors who surrendered faced new ordeal. Soviet captivity, the march to prison camps, in winter, weak from starvation, sick from disease, frostbitten, exhausted. Many died on the march, couldn't keep pace, were left behind, froze, died where they fell. The march was death march for thousands. The survivors reached camps, found conditions that were harsh. Food was scarce throughout Soviet Union. Prisoners received minimal rations. Many continued starving. Many died from disease, from typhus, from dysentery, from the weakened condition the pocket had created. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only approximately 6,000 eventually returned to Germany. Most died in captivity. In the years after Stalingrad, some died within weeks, some within months. Some survived years before dying. The pocket's death sentence was delayed for some, but not revoked. Most who were trapped died eventually, whether in the pocket or in the camps. The survival rate from encirclement to eventual return home was approximately 2%. 98% of those encircled died. The pocket was death trap, was execution by starvation and cold and attrition, was place where survival was exception, where death was rule, where the arithmetic from the beginning showed what would happen, where the outcome was determined by mathematics, by supplies that couldn't arrive, by relief that couldn't reach, by cold that couldn't be endured, by starvation that couldn't be survived. The pocket at Stalingrad was catastrophe, was demonstration of what encirclement meant in winter, in extreme conditions, without supply. Was evidence that Hitler's orders could kill entire armies, that obedience could be fatal, that the Eastern Front recognized no limits, showed no mercy, offered no escape. The pocket was tomb, was grave for 250,000 men, was evidence of the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, was proof that survival required more than courage, more than discipline, more than duty, required luck, required circumstances, required factors beyond control. The pocket at Stalingrad offered none of these, offered only death, slow, cold, hungry, inevitable. The pocket was hell, was demonstration of what the Eastern Front could be at its worst, was preview of what awaited other encircled forces, was warning unheeded, was catastrophe complete. Capture on the Eastern Front was often death sentence, just slower death than combat. The treatment of prisoners by both sides violated every standard of war, violated the Geneva Conventions systematically, created mortality rates that were genocidal. The statistics revealed the brutality. German forces captured approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers during the war. Of these, approximately 3.3 million died in German captivity. The mortality rate was 57%, more than half. Soviet forces captured approximately 3 million German soldiers. Of these, approximately 1 million died in Soviet captivity. The mortality rate was 33%, 1 in 3. Both rates were catastrophic. Both were evidence of systematic mistreatment. The German treatment of Soviet prisoners was policy, was deliberate, was genocidal. The Nazi ideology viewed Slavic peoples as subhuman, viewed Soviet soldiers as barely human. The Wehrmacht and SS applied this ideology, treated Soviet prisoners accordingly. The prisoner camps were death traps, were designed to kill, were places where death was intended, was expected, was policy. The camps were often open areas, fields, surrounded by wire, without shelter, without barracks, without buildings. The prisoners stood or sat in the open, exposed to weather, to rain, to cold, to sun, without protection. The camps in autumn and winter were particularly deadly. The prisoners stood in rain, in snow, without shelter, without adequate clothing, froze. The camps in summer were better, but still brutal, still deadly. The food was minimal, often just soup, watery, with minimal nutritional value. The caloric content was perhaps 500 calories daily, sometimes less. A human body requires approximately 1,200 calories at rest. More when working, more in cold. The rations weren't sufficient, weren't intended to be sufficient. The prisoners starved. Slowly, progressively, became skeletal, became too weak to stand, died. The death from starvation took weeks, sometimes months, but was certain. The arithmetic was clear. The calories provided were less than required. The deficit accumulated. Death was inevitable. The medical care was non-existent. Prisoners who were sick weren't treated, were left to die. Prisoners who were wounded weren't treated, died from untreated wounds, died from infection, from gangrene, from complications that were preventable, that were treatable. But treatment wasn't provided, wasn't policy. The prisoners died from causes that were survivable with minimal care. The lack of care was intentional, was policy, was murder by neglect. The forced labor killed many. Prisoners were used as slave labor, worked in factories, in mines, in construction. The work was hard, the conditions brutal, the rations remained insufficient. The prisoners worked until they died, were replaced by more prisoners who also worked until they died. The system was self-sustaining. The supply of prisoners seemed endless in the early war. The death rate was acceptable to those running the system, was intended. The prisoners were expendable, were resources to be used and discarded. The winter of 1941 to 42 was particularly deadly for Soviet prisoners. Hundreds of thousands died. The combination of exposure, starvation, disease killed on massive scale. The camps were death factories. The prisoners stood in open compounds in temperatures below freezing, below zero, without shelter, without adequate food, without hope, died in enormous numbers. The bodies piled up, were buried in mass graves, or left where they fell until spring. The winter camps were extermination sites, were places where Soviet prisoners were murdered through deliberate policy of neglect and exposure. The survival rate for Soviet prisoners was low throughout the war, improved slightly after the worst period, but remained terrible. The prisoners who survived were those who were lucky, who avoided disease, who received slightly better rations due to work assignments, who were in camps where conditions were marginally better. But survival was exception. Most prisoners died. The statistics confirm this. 57% mortality, 3.3 million dead. The numbers are so large they become abstract, but each number was person. Was soldier who surrendered, who expected treatment according to conventions of war, who instead was murdered through systematic neglect and brutality. The Soviet treatment of German prisoners was also brutal, but different. The Soviet camps were harsh, were deadly, but weren't specifically designed for extermination. The mortality rate was 33%, lower than German rate, but still catastrophic. The causes were similar: inadequate food, harsh conditions, disease, forced labor. But the intent was different. The Soviet system was brutal to everyone, to its own people, to prisoners. The brutality was systemic, was how the system operated. Wasn't specifically genocidal toward German prisoners, just brutal toward everyone. The German prisoners were held in camps throughout Soviet Union, in Siberia, in Central Asia, in remote areas. The conditions varied. Some camps were worse than others. All were harsh. The food was scarce throughout Soviet Union during and after the war. Prisoners received minimal rations, often less than Soviet civilians. The rations were insufficient. The prisoners starved. Not as rapidly as Soviet prisoners in German camps, but starved nonetheless. Became weak, became sick. Many died. The disease was epidemic in Soviet camps. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. The sanitary conditions were poor. The medical care was limited. The prisoners were weakened by hunger, were vulnerable to infection. The disease spread, killed thousands. The camps became disease incubators. The prisoners who survived disease often died from forced labor, were worked in mines, in logging, in construction, in rebuilding destroyed Soviet infrastructure. The work was hard, the conditions brutal. The weakened prisoners died, were replaced by others who also died. The system ground through prisoners, used them up, discarded them when they died. The German prisoners were held for years. Some weren't released until the 1950s, a decade after the war ended. The prolonged captivity killed many, even those who survived the initial years. The accumulated toll of harsh conditions, of inadequate nutrition, of disease, of forced labor, eventually broke health, eventually killed. The survivors who finally returned to Germany were damaged, physically broken, psychologically scarred. Many died shortly after return. The captivity had destroyed their health. The release came too late. The prisoner experience on both sides was catastrophe, was evidence that the Eastern Front recognized no limits, no conventions, no restraint. The treatment of prisoners was systematic brutality, was murder on industrial scale. The numbers are so large they lose meaning. 6.7 million prisoners captured total. 4.3 million died in captivity total. The mortality rate overall was 64%. Nearly 2 in 3 prisoners died. The statistics reveal that capture was death sentence more often than not. That surrender meant trading quick death in combat for slow death in camps. That the brutality extended beyond battlefield, extended to prisoners who were helpless, who were at mercy of captors, who received no mercy, who died in enormous numbers, who were murdered through deliberate policy or through systematic neglect, who are counted among the tens of millions who died on the Eastern Front, who are part of the catastrophe, part of the evidence that this was most brutal battlefield in history. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked inflection point, marked shift from German offense to German defense, from German advance to German retreat, but the shift wasn't immediate, wasn't total. Germany still had military capacity, still had forces that could attack, still had leadership that believed in victory. One more offensive, one more attempt to regain initiative, one more battle that might change the trajectory. The battle would be Kursk, would be last major German offensive on Eastern Front, would fail, would mark definitive end of German offensive capability. The Kursk salient was bulge in the Soviet lines. Extended westward, was vulnerable to attack from north and south. German forces could attack both sides, could encircle Soviet forces in the salient, could destroy multiple Soviet armies, could regain initiative. The plan was logical, was tactically sound, but required surprise, required forces that Germany was struggling to assemble, required time to prepare. The preparation took months. The time allowed Soviets to prepare as well, to fortify the salient, to create defensive depth, to position reserves, to prepare for attack they knew was coming. The Battle of Kursk began July 5, 1943. German forces attacked from north and south simultaneously. The attacks met massive defensive positions, mines, anti-tank ditches, fortified positions, artillery. The German advance was slow, measured in kilometers, gained at high cost. The Soviet defense was elastic, traded space for time, for casualties inflicted. The German forces advanced, but couldn't achieve breakthrough, couldn't reach open ground beyond the defenses, couldn't achieve encirclement. The attack stalled, the casualties mounted, the offensive failed. The Soviet counter-offensive began while the German attack was still underway. Soviet forces attacked German positions elsewhere along the front, drove them back. The German forces at Kursk had to withdraw, had to give up gains, had to retreat to start lines, then beyond. The momentum had shifted. The Soviets were attacking, the Germans were defending. The pattern would continue, would characterize the rest of the war. The Germans would retreat, would fight defensive battles, would lose ground progressively, would be driven westward, back toward Germany, back toward Berlin. The process took 2 years, but was inexorable, was unstoppable. The outcome was determined at Kursk. The execution would take time, but the result was certain. The Soviet offensives of late 1943 and 1944 were massive, were coordinated, were relentless. Operation Bagration in June 1944 was particularly devastating. Targeted German Army Group Center, destroyed it, created encirclements that mirrored German tactics of 1941. The Germans who had encircled Soviet armies in 41 were themselves encircled in 44. The trapped forces were destroyed. Over 300,000 German casualties. The Soviet advance accelerated, crossed Belarus, entered Poland, approached East Prussia. The German homeland was threatened. The advance occurred along entire front. In the south, Soviet forces drove into Romania, into Bulgaria, into Hungary, approached Yugoslavia. The Axis allies collapsed. Changed sides. Romania switched to the Allies. Bulgaria switched. The German positions were untenable. The retreat continued. The German forces fought defensive battles, sometimes fierce, sometimes skillful, but always retreating, always losing ground. The tide had turned completely. The momentum was Soviet. The outcome was inevitable. Just the timing was uncertain. The Soviet forces reached German borders in late 1944. Crossed into East Prussia, the war had come to Germany. The civilian population fled. Millions of refugees moved westward, ahead of the Soviet advance. The fear of Soviet revenge was powerful, was justified. The German forces and civilians understood what was coming, understood that the atrocities committed in Soviet Union would be repaid. The retreat became exodus. The roads filled with refugees, with soldiers, with vehicles, moving west, trying to stay ahead of the advancing Red Army. The Soviet advance into Germany was accompanied by atrocities. Revenge for what had been done in Soviet Union. Rape was widespread, systematic in some areas. The estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of German women were raped. The violence was tolerated by Soviet command, was sometimes encouraged, was revenge, was breakdown of discipline, was ugliness that accompanied the advance. The German civilians suffered. The atrocities were real, were widespread, were part of the catastrophe, part of the brutality that characterized the Eastern Front throughout. The German resistance stiffened as Soviet forces approached Berlin. The defense of the homeland was different from defense of occupied territory. The soldiers fought harder, knew they were defending families, knew that defeat meant occupation, meant revenge. The defense was fierce, but ultimately futile. The Soviet forces were too strong, too numerous, too well supplied. The advance continued, slower near Berlin, but continued. The outcome was certain. Just the cost was being determined. How many more would die before surrender? How much more destruction before the end? The progression from Stalingrad to Berlin took 2 years, from February 43 to April 45. The distance was approximately 2,000 kilometers, 1,200 miles. The Soviet forces had to fight for every kilometer, had to overcome defensive positions, had to sustain logistics across vast distances, had to maintain momentum despite casualties. The casualties on both sides were enormous. Millions more died in these 2 years. Millions more were wounded. The destruction continued. Cities were destroyed. Infrastructure was demolished. The fighting didn't decrease in intensity, didn't become less brutal, just shifted direction. The Germans who had advanced in 41 retreated in 44 and 45. The Soviets who had retreated in 41 advanced in 44 and 45. The roles reversed. The brutality remained. The casualties continued mounting. The catastrophe continued. The Eastern Front consumed lives and nations until finally, eventually, the war ended. The fighting stopped. The catastrophe concluded. Not because the capacity for violence was exhausted, but because one side surrendered, because Berlin fell, because Germany was defeated, because the war ended. But the cost, the toll, the suffering, the tens of millions dead, the destroyed cities, the devastated populations, these remained. These were permanent. These were what the Eastern Front had created. These were the evidence of what had happened between June 1941 and May 1945. Between the border and Berlin, between invasion and surrender, between the beginning and the end of the most brutal battlefield in human history. Berlin in April 1945 was surrounded. Soviet forces approached from east and north and south. The city was capital of Reich that was collapsing. The government still functioned barely. Hitler was in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issued orders to armies that barely existed, commanded forces that were destroyed or exhausted or surrounded. The reality was denial. The orders were fantasies. The war was lost. Everyone knew except those giving orders. The city prepared for siege, for final battle, for destruction that was coming. That was inevitable. That was days away. The Soviet forces assembled for the assault were enormous. Over 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, over 40,000 artillery pieces. The concentration of force was unprecedented, was largest assembly of military power in history. The goal was to capture Berlin, to end the war, to crush Nazi Germany completely. The preparation was thorough. The artillery was positioned, the ammunition was stockpiled. The attack routes were planned, the objectives were assigned. The Soviet forces were ready. The German defense was desperate, included everyone who could hold a weapon. Regular Wehrmacht units, SS divisions, Volkssturm militia of old men and boys, Hitler youth. Some were 15 years old, some were 60. The training was minimal. The equipment was inadequate, but they were ordered to defend. Were told Berlin must be held, must not fall. The orders were obeyed. The defense was organized. The city was fortified. Barricades were built. Anti-tank obstacles were positioned. Defensive positions were prepared. The civilians who remained sheltered in basements, in subway tunnels, in bunkers, waited for the battle, waited for the end. The assault began April 16th. Soviet artillery opened fire. The bombardment was massive, lasted hours. The shells fell continuously, thousands per minute. The city shook. Buildings collapsed. Fire spread. The bombardment was preparation, was intended to destroy German defensive positions, to demoralize defenders, to announce that the end had come. The bombardment achieved its purposes. The destruction was enormous. The psychological impact was crushing. The Soviet forces attacked after the bombardment, crossed the Oder and Neisse rivers, advanced toward Berlin. German resistance was fierce initially. The defenders fought from prepared positions, used Panzerfausts against tanks, used every weapon available, inflicted casualties, slowed the advance, but couldn't stop it. The Soviet forces had overwhelming superiority, had more men, more tanks, more artillery, more everything. The German resistance was courage without capacity, was determination without resources, was futile ultimately, but continued. The defenders fought, died, were replaced by others who also fought and died. The pattern continued. The city fighting began when Soviet forces entered Berlin's outskirts. The combat became urban warfare, building to building, street to street. The same pattern as Stalingrad, but roles reversed. Now Soviets were attackers, Germans were defenders. The fighting was close, brutal, continuous. The Germans used their knowledge of the city, used buildings as fortresses, used rubble as defensive positions, made Soviets pay for every advance, made every street costly, every building deadly. The artillery continued firing throughout. Soviet guns shelled buildings before infantry attacked, reduced them to rubble. Then infantry advanced through the ruins, cleared remaining defenders. The process was systematic, was methodical, was destructive. The city was being demolished, building by building, block by block, district by district. The destruction was total. Fire consumed areas that artillery hadn't destroyed. The city was dying, was being killed deliberately. The civilian population suffered, trapped in basements, in shelters. Some were killed by bombardment. Some were killed in crossfire. Some emerged from shelters to find their neighborhoods destroyed. Their buildings collapsed. Their world ended. The Reichstag became symbol, the parliament building, empty of government, but symbol nonetheless. The Soviet forces attacked it April 30th. The building was defended by SS troops. The fighting was room to room, floor to floor, was close, was vicious. The Soviets eventually prevailed. Raised Soviet flag over the Reichstag. The photograph became iconic, became symbol of victory, became evidence that Berlin had fallen, that Germany was defeated. The Reichstag's capture was symbolic. The battle for Berlin continued. But the symbolism mattered. The image of Soviet flag over the Reichstag announced to the world that the war was ending, that Soviet Union had won, that Nazi Germany was destroyed. Hitler committed suicide April 30th in his bunker, with the battle raging above. With the city falling around him, the suicide was escape, was refusal to face consequences, was end that was cowardly after 12 years of causing catastrophe. The body was burned, was disposed of. The details were murky. The death was confirmed later, but in the moment, in the bunker, the remaining Nazi leadership learned their Führer was dead. The cause they'd served was ended. The regime was finished. The German forces in Berlin surrendered May 2nd. The remaining commanders negotiated with Soviets, agreed to cease fire, agreed to surrender. Not all units complied immediately. Some continued fighting. Some tried to break out, to escape to West, to surrender to Western allies instead of Soviets. Some succeeded. Most didn't. Most were captured. Most went into Soviet captivity. The organized resistance in Berlin ended. The battle was over. The city had fallen. The casualties in the Berlin operation were staggering. Soviet losses exceeded 300,000. Killed, wounded, missing. The German casualties were similar, perhaps higher. The exact numbers are disputed, but the general magnitude is accepted. Over 500,000 casualties in the battle for Berlin. In 3 weeks, the rate of loss was extraordinary, was testament to the intensity of the fighting, to the desperation of the defense, to the determination of the attack, to the brutality that characterized the Eastern Front until the very end. The civilian deaths in Berlin are estimated at approximately 100,000. The estimates vary. The chaos made accurate counting impossible. But tens of thousands of civilians died from bombardment, from fighting, from suicide. Many Germans committed suicide as Soviet forces approached, chose death over capture, over occupation, over unknown future. The suicides numbered in thousands. The civilian toll added to military toll created total casualty count that exceeded 500,000 in single city in 3 weeks. Germany's unconditional surrender came May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe ended. The Eastern Front ceased to exist. The fighting stopped. The catastrophe concluded. The silence after 4 years of continuous violence was jarring. The absence of artillery, the absence of bombing, the absence of combat was strange, was relief, was beginning of processing what had happened, what had been endured, what had been lost. Berlin was ruins. The city was destroyed. Buildings were collapsed. Streets were impassable. Fire had consumed districts. Water mains were broken. Power was out. Gas lines were ruptured. The infrastructure was devastated. The population that remained was traumatized, hungry, homeless often. The city that had been capital of Reich was corpse, was evidence of what total war produced, was demonstration that modern warfare could destroy cities completely, could eliminate them as functioning entities, could turn them into wastelands that would take decades to rebuild. The Soviet forces occupied the ruins, established military government, began organizing the chaos, began establishing order. The occupation would last years, would last decades, would divide the city, would divide Germany, would create Cold War boundaries. But in May 1945, the immediate task was survival, was feeding the population, was clearing rubble, was burying dead, was beginning the long process of recovery from catastrophe. The battle for Berlin was final major battle of Eastern Front, was last major urban battle, was conclusion of war that had begun at Soviet border in June 1941. The war had come full circle, had started with German invasion of Soviet Union, had ended with Soviet occupation of Germany. The progression had taken 4 years, had cost over 30 million lives, had destroyed cities, had devastated nations, had created suffering on scale unprecedented in human history. The Eastern Front had been most brutal battlefield, had been place where modern warfare's capacity for destruction was fully realized, where ideological war met total war, where the result was catastrophe beyond imagination. Berlin's fall marked the end, marked conclusion, marked final evidence of what had been created, what had been endured, what had been survived. The Eastern Front was over. The war was ending, but the consequences, the costs, the memories, these would last forever, would shape nations, would shape generations, would remain as testament to what happens when total war is fought without limits, without mercy, without any consideration except victory or death. Berlin had fallen. The war was ending. The catastrophe was complete. The Eastern Front wasn't just war between armies, was war against geography, against distance, against environment. The vast spaces of the Soviet Union became weapon. The distances that had to be crossed, the terrain that had to be traversed, the climate that had to be endured. These weren't just difficulties, were factors that determined outcomes, that killed as effectively as combat, that shaped strategy, that limited what was possible. Understanding the Eastern Front requires understanding the geography, the distances, the mud, the cold, the environment that was hostile to everyone. The distance from the German border to Moscow was approximately 1,000 kilometers, 620 miles. From the border to Stalingrad was approximately 2,000 kilometers, 1,240 miles. These weren't distances that could be covered quickly. The Wehrmacht was mechanized partially, had tanks, had trucks, but most soldiers marched on foot. Most supplies were moved by horse-drawn wagons. The advance in 1941 averaged approximately 15 kilometers per day, 9 miles. At that rate, reaching Moscow required over 2 months of continuous advance. Any delay, any pause, extended the timeline, extended the exposure, extended the toll on men and equipment. The march itself was exhausting. Soldiers carried equipment weighing 30 to 40 kilograms, 65 to 90 pounds, rifles, ammunition, entrenching tools, gas masks, rations, personal items. The weight was distributed but constant, was carried for 10 hours daily, 12 hours. The infantry divisions marched distances daily, 20 kilometers, 25, day after day, week after week, month after month, in summer heat, in autumn rain, in winter cold. The physical toll accumulated, blisters formed, feet became damaged, boots wore out, replacements were scarce. Soldiers marched in damaged boots, in improvised footwear. The pain was constant. The exhaustion was cumulative. The soldiers became worn down before combat even began. The simple act of crossing the distance was consuming strength, was reducing combat effectiveness, was creating casualties through exhaustion and disease before enemy action killed anyone. The medical officers noted this, reported that soldiers were arriving at front already exhausted, already weakened, already less effective than they should be. The distance was taking toll, was degrading the army, was weapon that killed through attrition, through accumulated wear, through the simple mathematics of human limits. The Soviet forces faced same distances in reverse, retreated across vast spaces in 1941, then advanced back across those spaces in 1943 and 44. The toll was similar. The exhaustion was universal. The Red Army soldiers also marched enormous distances, also carried heavy loads, also suffered from the accumulated toll. The distances killed everyone, reduced everyone, made everything harder. The armies, on both sides, were degraded by geography before combat occurred. The weakened armies then fought. The results were affected by the exhaustion, by the reduced capacity, by the toll that distance had extracted. The supply line stretched as armies advanced. The German supply system was a masterpiece of planning in theory, was inadequate in practice. The system was based on European infrastructure, expected paved roads, expected rail network, expected European rail gauge. Found different reality. Found unpaved roads that became dust in summer, became mud in autumn and spring. Found rail network that was sparse, that used wider gauge than European standard. The Soviet gauge was 1520 millimeters. The European standard was 1435 millimeters. The difference was small, was critical. German trains couldn't run on Soviet tracks. The rails had to be converted, or supplies had to be transferred to Soviet rolling stock, or shipped by truck from railheads. Each method was slow, was limited in capacity, was inadequate for needs. The conversion of rail gauge required labor, required time, required materials. Engineer units followed the advancing armies, converted track from Soviet gauge to European. The work was continuous, was never fast enough. The railheads remained far behind the front. The distance between railhead and front grew. Supplies had to be trucked across this distance. The trucks consumed fuel, required maintenance, broke down frequently on poor roads. The truck fleet was never sufficient, was constantly strained, was constantly losing vehicles to breakdowns. To where? To combat damage. The gap between what could be delivered and what was needed grew. The Soviet supply system was different, was cruder but better adapted. The Soviet system assumed poor infrastructure, assumed dirt roads, assumed long distances, was designed for these conditions. The trucks were simple, were robust. The Gaz and ZIS trucks were adequate for Soviet roads, were maintainable with limited tools, limited expertise. The Soviet logistics officers understood their system, understood its limits, planned within those limits. The Soviet supply lines also stretched as they advanced, but contracted as they retreated. The shorter supply lines when defending were advantage, allowed better supply, better support. The lengthening supply lines when advancing created same problems Germans had faced, but the Soviets learned, adapted, improved their logistics. By 1944, by the final advances, the Soviet supply system was functional, was adequate, was supporting advances across vast distances. The distances affected command and control. Coordinating operations across 2,000-kilometer front was challenge. Communications were by radio, by telephone when lines existed, by courier when they didn't. The delays were significant. Orders took hours to reach units, sometimes days. Reports took same time to reach headquarters. The situation changed while reports traveled. The orders based on old reports arrived too late, were irrelevant, were ignored sometimes. The commanders at front made decisions, couldn't wait for orders. The delays created friction, created problems, created situations where coordination was impossible, where different units operated independently, sometimes at cross purposes. The distances made central control difficult, made lower-level initiative necessary, made mistakes inevitable. The Rasputitsa was environmental factor that shaped campaigns, occurred twice yearly, in autumn when rains came, in spring when snow melted. The ground became mud, not just wet soil, mud that had specific character, glutinous, deep, sticky. The mud could be knee-deep, hip-deep. The vehicles sank. The wheels or tracks couldn't gain traction, couldn't move forward. The vehicles were stuck. Required towing, required multiple vehicles to extract one stuck vehicle. The process was slow, was exhausting, often failed. The vehicles were abandoned, were left to sink completely, were dug out later if possible, often weren't. The horses suffered terribly in Rasputitsa. The wagons they pulled sank, became immovable. The horses strained, exhausted themselves trying to move wagons that wouldn't move. The horses sank themselves, to their bellies, couldn't free themselves, died standing, trapped in mud. The losses of horses during Rasputitsa were enormous. Thousands died. The carcasses were left where they fell, sank into mud, disappeared. The loss of horses reduced logistics capacity, made resupply harder, made movement of artillery impossible, made everything worse. The soldiers marched through mud that reached their knees. Each step required effort, required pulling foot from mud, placing it forward, sinking again. The march rate dropped to kilometers per day, sometimes less. The exhaustion was extreme. Soldiers collapsed, couldn't continue, were left to rest, to follow when able. The units became strung out, lost cohesion, lost effectiveness. The Rasputitsa reduced armies to crawling pace, reduced operations to survival, to waiting for ground to freeze or dry, to hoping conditions would improve. The waiting was enforced pause, was frustration for commanders. German commanders in autumn 41 watched as Moscow remained just ahead, watched as mud stopped them, watched as time passed, as winter approached, as opportunity slipped away. Couldn't do anything, couldn't force movement through mud, could only wait. The wait was fatal to German plans. Gave Soviets time to prepare, time to organize, time to survive. The Rasputitsa was unplanned ally, was factor that affected timing, that delayed operations, that changed outcomes, that demonstrated that geography and climate were participants in war, were factors beyond human control, were determinants that armies couldn't overcome through will or force, could only endure. The terrain varied along the front, created different challenges for different sectors. In the north, the Baltic region, the terrain was forests and swamps. The forests were dense, old growth in some areas. The trees were close. The undergrowth was thick. Visibility was limited. Movement off roads was difficult, nearly impossible for vehicles. The roads themselves were few, were poor quality. The forests channeled movement, forced armies to advance along limited routes, created choke points, created defensive advantages. The defender could cover the limited routes, could fortify them, could make advance costly. The attacker couldn't maneuver, couldn't flank through forest, had to attack frontally, had to accept casualties. The terrain in north favored defense strongly. The swamps added to difficulty. The Baltic region had extensive wetlands, marshes, bogs. The ground was waterlogged, was impassable often. Even in summer, in winter the swamps froze, became passable, but in other seasons were barriers, were obstacles that couldn't be crossed. The swamps channeled movement further, restricted options further, made offense in this region nearly impossible, made defense relatively easy. The terrain explained why Army Group North's advance was slowest, why Leningrad wasn't captured despite siege, why progress in this region was measured in meters rather than kilometers. In the center, around Moscow and Smolensk, the terrain was mixed. Some forests, but not as dense as north. Some open ground, fields, meadows. Some rivers and streams. The road network was better than north. More roads, better quality. Still poor by Western standards, but adequate for military movement. The terrain allowed mechanized warfare in some areas. The open ground permitted tank operations, permitted maneuver. The forests required infantry, required different tactics. The combination created operational environment that was challenging but manageable, allowed for deep penetrations, for encirclements, for mobile warfare. The terrain in center was where war of movement flourished, where the great encirclement battles occurred, where distances could be covered rapidly. In the south, the Ukrainian steppe, the terrain was fundamentally different, open, flat, grassland extending to horizon. Few trees, few obstacles, few defensible positions. The terrain favored attacker, favored mechanized warfare. The panzer divisions operated effectively here, could maneuver freely, could achieve deep penetrations, could encircle large forces. The open ground also favored defender with prepared positions, with anti-tank guns covering approaches, with artillery dominating open areas. But the attacker with superiority could overcome defenses, could break through, could exploit. The steppe was tank country, was where armor decisive, was terrain that invited maneuver warfare. But the steppe's character changed with weather. When dry, was perfect for mechanized operations. When wet, was disaster. The Rasputitsa turned steppe into mudfield. The open ground that had been advantage became trap. The tanks bogged. The trucks stuck. The horses sank. Movement stopped. The army that had been mobile became stationary. The advantages disappeared. The terrain that had favored attacker became neutral. The steppe demonstrated that terrain characteristics were conditional, were dependent on weather, were changeable, were unpredictable. The same ground that allowed rapid advance in summer stopped all movement in autumn. The variability was factor in planning, was risk, was uncertainty that affected operations. The rivers were obstacles throughout the front. The Soviet Union had major rivers running generally north-south. The Dnieper, the Don, the Volga. These rivers were wide, were deep, required bridging, required crossing operations. The rivers became defensive lines, became positions where Soviet forces could establish defense, could force Germans to conduct river crossings. The crossings were difficult, were costly, required engineering support, required time. The rivers slowed German advance, created pauses, created opportunities for Soviet forces to reorganize, to establish new defensive lines. The geography of rivers shaped operations, determined where advances could occur, where defenses would be established. The distances affected medical care. The wounded were evacuated from front to aid stations, from aid stations to field hospitals, from field hospitals to base hospitals. Each step required transport, required time. The distances between echelons were large. The transport was by ambulance when available, by horse-drawn wagon often, by any means possible. The journey could take days. The wounded suffered during transport, in pain, without adequate analgesia, bouncing in wagons on poor roads. Many died during evacuation, from wounds, from shock, from complications. The distances killed wounded who might have survived with faster care. The medical system was adequate in theory, was overwhelmed by distance in practice. The geography made medical support harder, made survival less likely, made wounds more lethal. The psychological impact of distances was significant. Soldiers understood they were far from home, far from safety. The distance couldn't be covered quickly, couldn't be escaped easily, if wounded, if defeated. The distance home was vast, was unreachable. The awareness created anxiety, created sense of isolation, created understanding that there was no quick exit, no easy escape. The psychological weight was real, was oppressive, was factor in morale, in willingness to continue, in ability to endure. The distances that were physical obstacles were also psychological burdens, were weights that pressed on soldiers, that affected thinking, that influenced behavior, that contributed to stress, to exhaustion, to breakdown. The horses deserve particular attention. The Wehrmacht used approximately 750,000 horses during Operation Barbarossa. 750,000 animals. The horses were essential, were majority of logistics capacity, were how supplies moved from railheads to front, were how artillery moved, were how armies functioned. The horses required care, required feeding, required water, required rest. An army of 3 million men required enormous logistics. An army with 750,000 horses required even more. The horses consumed fodder daily, 20 pounds per horse, times 750,000 horses. The tonnage was enormous. was competitor with human rations, with ammunition, with fuel. The horses were logistical burden, were necessary burden, but burden nonetheless. The horses died in enormous numbers, from exhaustion, from disease, from lack of fodder, from cold, from overwork. The losses were continuous, were unsustainable. By winter 41, hundreds of thousands of the horses were dead. The replacements couldn't match losses. The Wehrmacht's logistics capacity declined as horses died. The decline was progressive, was critical. By end of war, German army had far fewer horses than at start. The deficit was never made up, was never addressed. The loss of horses was factor in German defeat, was part of logistics failure, was evidence that the distances and climate killed everything, killed men and animals and machines, killed capacity to wage war. The horse's story is overlooked often, is part of Eastern Front's brutality, is evidence of the comprehensive toll the environment extracted. The horses suffered as much as humans, died in similar numbers relative to population, contributed essential service, paid terrible price, were victims of the Eastern Front's geography, of distances that exhausted, of climate that killed, of war that consumed everything. The geography of the Eastern Front was weapon, was participant, was factor that killed millions, that shaped outcomes, that determined fates. The distances exhausted, the mud stopped, the terrain channeled, the rivers blocked, the climate killed. The combination created environment that was hostile to everyone. That made everything harder. That turned simple operations into ordeals. That made logistics impossible. That degraded armies before they fought. That continued degrading them after. The geography was reality that couldn't be changed, couldn't be overcome, could only be endured, could only be accepted. The armies that understood this, that adapted to it, that planned for it, survived better. The armies that didn't, that tried to overcome geography through force, through will, failed, were destroyed by distances they couldn't cross, by mud they couldn't traverse, by climate they couldn't endure. The Eastern Front's geography was brutal, was unforgiving, was factor that must be understood, must be remembered, must be acknowledged as participant in catastrophe, as weapon that killed millions, as reality that shaped everything. The geography of the Eastern Front wasn't backdrop, was active participant, was determinant, was a weapon more effective than many armies, was factor that made the Eastern Front the most brutal battlefield in human history. The battles are silent now. The fronts are gone. The armies dispersed. The trenches filled. The ruins mostly rebuilt. 80 years have passed. The Eastern Front exists only in memory, in records, in the testimony of those who were there and are now mostly gone. In the mark it left on nations, on populations, on understanding of what war means. We've walked through 4 years together, from the invasion of June 1941 to the surrender of May 1945, from the border to Moscow to Leningrad to Stalingrad to Berlin, through summer heat and winter cold and spring mud, through distances that exhausted, through cold that killed, through starvation that murdered, through combat that consumed, through catastrophe that lasted and deepened and finally ended, but never truly ended because the cost remains still. 30 million. The number we return to, the number that defines, that shows the scale, that demonstrates the magnitude, but also obscures, makes individuals into statistics, makes personal tragedies into historical data. Each of the 30 million was person, was alive, had hopes, had fears, had families, had futures. The number honors their sacrifice by showing the scale, dishonors their individuality by making them one of millions. The tension is unresolvable, is inherent in remembering catastrophe of this magnitude. The Eastern Front was brutal because of combination. because of ideology that made it war of annihilation, because of geography that made it war against distance, because of climate that made it war against nature, because of totalitarian systems that could absorb catastrophic losses and demand more sacrifice, because of duration that allowed casualties to accumulate over 4 years, because of totality that recognized no limits, no restraints, no mercy. The combination created catastrophe, created the most brutal battlefield in human history. The remembering is important, not because the Eastern Front was unique in every way. Many wars are brutal. Many wars kill millions. Many wars destroy. But the Eastern Front was unique in scale, in intensity, in sustained brutality over years, in casualties that exceeded 30 million. In demonstrating what modern warfare could do when waged without restraint. The remembering preserves this understanding, preserves the knowledge of what happened, what it cost, what it means. Rest now. The history is told, the battles are described, the casualties are counted, the catastrophe is documented. The Eastern Front, from 1941 to 1945, from the border to Berlin, from invasion to surrender, from beginning to end of most brutal battlefield in human history. The soldiers who fought there, the civilians who died there, the millions who suffered there, are remembered, are honored through understanding, through acknowledgement, through refusing to forget. The war ended 80 years ago, but the memory remains, must remain, as testament, as warning. As acknowledgement of what happened, of what humans endured, of what humans inflicted on each other, the Eastern Front, the Great Patriotic War, the war that killed 30 million, that destroyed nations, that changed history, that demonstrated the ultimate cost of total war. Is history now, is memory, is lesson, is responsibility to remember, to understand, to ensure it's never forgotten. The most brutal battlefield in human history, the Eastern Front, now quiet, now still, but never silent, never forgotten, always remembered.